In my opinion, horror is often one of the genres that's the most difficult to get right. That's why so much of the horror we see these days is filled with cheap and easy scares. Truly getting under someone's skin and then staying there is a difficult thing to manage. Still though, I always appreciate it when those making said horror actually try to deliver something legitimately scary, even if they fail. Uncanny Valley is a game that gets pretty close to actually hitting all the right notes. For me, it began to falter after I gave it a few extra playthroughs, something the game actively tells you to do, and I began to see the seams. It has the atmosphere just right, and loves to try and force you out of your comfort zone, but the first ending I got, in conjunction with a realization of how little of the game actually sees your character in danger, ended up spoiling the experience a bit. So let's break it down. Uncanny Valley is a 2D, pixel art based horror game, which reminds me quite a bit of a game that released a few years earlier, known as Home. Both are primarily 2D, atmospheric horror games that take after a point-and-click adventure style and offer a multitude of different outcomes based on your actions. The games are actually so similar that I figured they had been developed by the same people. But apparently not, with Home coming from Benjamin Rivers Inc. and Uncanny Valley being developed by Cowardly Creations. They may have some overlap, but I struggled to find any real information on either. Regardless, Uncanny Valley stars a man named Tom, as he takes a night job patrolling an abandoned research facility while the owners figure out what to do with it. We quickly learn that Tom is running from something in his past, which is why he chose to take such an out-of-the-way job. Along the way, he meets two other people. Buck is the day shift security guard for the facility, and more than just a bit rude. Eve takes care of the equally abandoned living quarters for the facility, and is much easier to get along with than Buck at the outset. Uncanny Valley's gameplay more or less comes in three flavors. The first would be the night terrors the game opens on. Whatever is in Tom's past still very much haunts him, and after your shift most nights you're likely to be forced into one of these night terrors. These primarily attempt to allude to what Tom is running from, while delivering the most surreal horror. Next would be your shifts in the higher levels of the facility, which will see several scripted events happen over time, and give you a multitude of ways to respond, which will affect the game going forward. Finally, there are the lower levels, where the shift timer goes away, and your first and only taste of combat begins. Unlike the night terrors, the horror here is very real, and players are meant to keep Tom alive long enough to escape. From here on out, be aware that I'll be spoiling a lot of what makes this game work as a horror experience, a lot of what doesn't, and how it all relates to the story. If you don't want to have it ruined for you, go play the game and then come back. It's not that long. Oh, and despite being pretty chunky pixel art, this game can get pretty violent and gory, so if you don't like that, you know what to do. We good? Okay. My first playthrough of Uncanny Valley was surprisingly unsettling, even scary at times. It does a good job of creating an oppressive atmosphere from the outset, but on top of that, the game initially gives the player several objectives that try to force the player into uncomfortable positions. Buck initially tells you that you need to patrol the upper levels each night, which, since the game explains that all of your choices matter, gives you the impression that you'll be judged on whether you actually do your job or not. The reality is that this isn't the case, but until you know that, and the fact that the upper levels don't actually have any real spooks in them, you feel like you're being forced into running around the dark, hostile-looking offices above. A bit later, Eve asks to meet you in the facility's recreational room. It happens so early that it's a bit uncomfortable. You don't really know her. It's even more strange because she chooses to keep the lights in the room off and doesn't really seem to act quite normal. Yet again, just a bit later, while the player is on their shift, the power suddenly goes out. They then either have to spend the rest of the night in near complete darkness, or venture into new territory outside and try to restart the generator. Again, at this point, the player isn't likely to understand that the facility is safe as long as you don't go to the lower levels. And when the lights suddenly go out, it's understandable if one assumes that this is where the upper levels also become unsafe. I personally got the impression that I had waited too long or something, and now whatever was in the lower levels had escaped. Again, this isn't the case, but the unknown, the fear of what could be, is one of the most powerful things you can do in horror. And forcing me to wander around in the dark and outside where I've never been before is really effective. My first playthrough stayed unsettling until the very end. I chose to do exactly what I was supposed to do each night, mostly to see what types of horrors were forced on me while doing so. To my surprise, the game just allowed me to scare myself the whole time. Because I didn't explore, I didn't make it to the lower levels, and that meant I was actually safe the entire time. I liked this a lot, particularly because it kept a lot of what the game was going to throw at me a mystery. It meant that I wasn't sure what would trigger real horror on subsequent playthroughs. Unfortunately, the more or less default ending for playing this way kind of spoiled what was going on before I'd had the chance to go in for a second playthrough. In this ending, you find out that Eve is not human, and she cuts you up to keep you forever. I think it would have been smarter to have Eve in this final scene look like a normal human, since the game instead chooses to reveal that she's a robot and has some sort of advanced AI inside. It potentially spoils a lot of what's going on if you chose to play this way. Granted, this still left me with a few questions, like whether the Eve I'd met earlier was real or not. And if she was, does that mean she was killed by a robot who's now wearing her skin? But regardless, I suddenly knew what the facility was for, what went wrong that left it abandoned, and that Eve is not to be trusted, despite not reading any of the emails or anything that I did later. This revelation only became more true when I got back to the first meeting with Eve and realized that she wasn't breathing, so she was always a robot. Had Eve in that first ending looked human, I would have understood that she was dangerous under certain circumstances, but I wouldn't have understood why. It would have forced me to explore to learn what was going on, and it would have kept a lot of the misdirection in the tapes and emails and such around the facility intact. The way it was, though, I knew the researcher was talking to Eve in the tapes as soon as I listened to them on my second playthrough. This didn't ruin the game in its entirety, but I find it really strange that a playthrough where the player just does what they're supposed to do wasn't well accommodated for. I mean, that's gotta be a pretty common first playthrough, right? So heck, why doesn't that instead end with the ending where the gangsters find Tom and execute him? That way it reveals nothing about what's going on because you didn't do any of the work to explore. Oh yeah, that's Tom's past, by the way. Apparently Tom witnessed a murder by some members of a gang, and now the gang is after him to keep him quiet. Importantly, the gang has paid off most of the police force where he lives. This is why the primary enemy in the Night Terrors is a shadowy figure with glowing white eyes. They're following him. They are always aware of where he is, but they could be anyone. So naturally, Tom ran as far as he could, hoping this job would keep him out of their reach. He was wrong, of course, and the gangsters show up under different circumstances depending on your choices. My first playthrough had them jump me after like 5 or 6 days, but before they could kill me, Eve takes care of them. I then woke up in a strange house that seemed to be connected to the facility, with Eve acting strange as if we were a couple. I then proceeded to gut myself with a shard of a mirror. Twice. So Eve decided to make sure I couldn't hurt myself anymore. Subsequent playthroughs saw me exploring both the world and the mechanics more. I found tapes where they interviewed Eve. She eventually did something terrible to a researcher. I played an arcade game, I found a fire extinguisher, and then was surprised when I could use it to gruesomely kill Buck in multiple ways. I ended up not getting enough done to change things though, and got the same ending through slightly different means. This time, instead of trying to kill myself, I escaped through the storage room in the fake home, and found myself in the lower levels of the facility. I pretty quickly got caught by a robot skeleton, couldn't escape, and was brought to Eve. The third playthrough, I refused to do any of the patrolling I was supposed to do, broke down every door in the apartment, and found a few keys and a keycard. I ended up using a key to Buck's car in order to escape. I later found out that doing this usually leads to you crashing into the car of the gangsters, but for some reason that didn't happen here, and I just escaped. I think it's because they come on an earlier day than I was on at that point. I continued to play through, the next time using the other key to unlock the safe and grab the second key card used to reach the lower levels. I made it most of the way through and probably would have survived and escaped with Buck had I just played a little smarter. The lower levels are patrolled by skeletal robots, the only real enemy in the game. At each new floor you get ammo for a pistol, which can be used to kill more or less one of these robots. However, you're pretty much guaranteed to take some damage in the process. Bandages will heal wounds, but they too are to my knowledge only found in the rooms between floors. When you get hurt by an enemy, the damage is randomly applied to a different body part. This has different effects, from causing Tom to be slower, make pained groaning noises that make stealth harder, or prevent him from performing actions like crouching. There are several ways to get through these lower floors. You can, for example, make liquid nitrogen to freeze the door, preventing the path forward, so that your fire extinguisher can break through it. Or you can do things like find an AI reprogramming module that makes one of the robots non-hostile if you can get close enough to it. They won't follow you past the door, but they'll open the door for you. By this point, the game had ceased to be scary for me at all. Part of this is because I don't really find the idea of unnetworked AI in a single body like the Terminator or something to be very frightening personally. The only time AI is remotely scary to me is if they can get control of like the entire world's computers or something. Even then though, it's not terrifying scary, it's just, well, we're screwed scary. Another part of it is because I'd already explored enough to know what dangers I actually faced. And part of it is because I'd been thrust into exploring these dangers before I understood them, kind of ruining the spooks of it. This meant that when I finally did put all of the pieces together, I'd already been forced to interface with the threat. Mechanically, there are really only a few missteps. I kind of wish you didn't have to go through the intro each time, since it never changes, and it doesn't change the rest of the game. For a game that actively tells you to play through it multiple times, it's kind of strange and obnoxious that I'm required to repeat the same exact intro for 5 minutes each time I play the game. The other issue is that the interface was clearly designed for PC, because using inventory objects in the world can be a bit difficult when your target is moving. Two solutions would be to either have Tom automatically run to any object you click on, or to speed up the cursor movement when you're choosing where to use an object. Allow it to be controlled with the right stick so you can still move Tom at the same time. Make the cursor magnetized back to the center as you let go of the stick, and don't let it go past Tom's interaction radius. That way you have maximum control and the game simply won't allow you to use an object when you're too far away. I suppose that the gun controls could also be improved. The gun isn't exactly a major part of the game. In fact, it's completely optional, so streamlining the controls so that you hold L2 to ready the weapon, press R2 to shoot, and square to reload like a normal game won't exactly break anything. You're still likely to get just as many shots in before you get hit, so it's not like this change would suddenly turn you into Rambo or something. Your ammo is too limited for that anyway. And if I really wanted to nitpick, I would have shortened the apartment hallways and offices so that you can sprint all the way across them without running out of sprint and needing to walk. Most of the apartments are empty, and all of the useful ones are further along the hallways, so shortening them so that I can sprint all the way from the elevator to the other end only makes sense. Same with the offices in the upper part of the facility. Remember, there's nothing that can hurt you in these areas. They're purely for exploration, so altering this only serves to benefit multiple playthroughs by making exploration in these areas less tedious. Other than that, the game works exactly as expected. It's a game with several really interesting ideas, some good mystery, great atmosphere, chilling music, and worthwhile choices. Improving the few issues it has, I think, could transform it from a decently good survival horror experience into a great one. But what do you guys think? Have you played Uncanny Valley? Did you enjoy it? Did it scare you? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.